All right, well, good afternoon, students, or whenever you're watching this. Hope you're well again. We are going to move on to lesson 2 in unit 3, talking about the Constitutional Convention in a new kind of layout or blueprint for how the government should work in the United States. In lesson 1, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, and we saw the weaknesses that those Articles of Confederation gave the national or the federal government in this newly formed United States of America. We saw the weaknesses of the Article of Confederation kind of play out with Shays' Rebellion. We saw how the national or the federal government could not go in and help the Massachusetts state government to kind of quell the rebellion or the unrest, to kind of help simmer it down. It's after Shays' Rebellion that we will see really the strong need for a new layout of government and the increasing slightly the power that the national government would hold. Because relatively speaking, there really was not any power within the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. It left the federal government very weak. Okay? So there's our learning objectives for today. And then we'll have some key terms as well. A lot of key figures and prominent people that will come up in today's lesson. And when it comes to American history, and when we see a lesson or really an event in American history that still applies to us today, this is going to be one of the most important ones. Because at this Constitutional Convention, we will get a new blueprint for government, and we still use this blueprint with some additions made along the way in the United States today. So even though this happens in the 1780s, we still use it in the year 2020. So a very important lesson that we'll be talking about today. All right. But as we already said, after Shays' Rebellion, many Americans agreed that the federal government needed to be stronger in order to hold together the Union. So a convention's called, and the intention of this convention is to go in and revise the Articles of Confederation. It was never the idea that we would go in, completely scrap the Articles of Confederation and come up with a whole new document. However, by the end of this convention, we will have a whole new document, which will be called the United States Constitution. But once again, it wasn't the intention when they went in, but they came out with a whole new blueprint and plan for how the government should work in the United States and the role that the government should play in our everyday lives in the country. All right. So like I said, from about late May until about the middle of September in 1787, the Constitutional Convention is held. A lot of prominent people come about and come join in on this convention. We'll talk about some big names like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington would be elected as really the first president of this convention. This isn't where he's the president of the United States just yet, but he is the president or the leader of this Constitutional Convention. So a lot of key players and figures will come about in today's lesson. Moving forward, as they gather, there's going to be a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different ideas for how strong the federal government should be, and different ideas on how the government should work and how the states should be represented. And this will be really one of the first times in American history that we see partisanship, or we see two different sides on fundamental issues really battling it out with each other. So the nastiness of politics stretches all the way back to the 1780s. It's not just a 2020 thing, as we saw in the recent presidential debates. We will still see issues all throughout American history when it comes to politics. But here's just a quick image of Independence Hall, as we call it today, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is the room that they met and had this Constitutional Convention in. You can imagine what the atmosphere must have been like in this room at this time, how hot and sweaty it must have been to be cooped up in here all day as you really take on the daunting task of developing a system of government and a blueprint for how this new country should run and revising those weak Articles of Confederation. Here's just a breakdown of the delegates and where they came from, their age, their education levels. In order to be present and to be really prominent at this convention, you had to be a well-educated, wealthy male in the states at this time. So not really a lot of diversity or a whether it be through race, whether it be through education levels or socioeconomic status. Most of these people were all very educated, wealthy men. But before the Constitution could be written and approved, the delegates need to come to an agreement on about what the document should contain. And to achieve this goal, they advanced and debated a number of proposals for several months. So several plans are put into place, like the Virginia Plan, which lays out the structure of government we have today. It lays out the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. One of the things that the Virginia Plan really didn't think about, though, was when it came to the representation and the amount of say each state should have. The Virginia Plan really laid out, and especially our legislative branch, that the House of Representatives and the Senate would both be determined representative-wise by state population. So we put forth, smaller states obviously don't like this, and William Patterson from New Jersey is going to put out his New Jersey plan, which would lay out one of the legislative branch houses. Looking at the Senate specifically today, would give each state equal representation. So while the big states will have a larger number of representation in the House of Representatives, in our Senate today, every state gets the same amount of representation and they get 2 senators. So there was some issues there that had to be sorted out, but ultimately they were able to come to a decision there and compromise. But then there are several other compromises that have to be determined. There's several other issues that have to be brought up. One of the biggest ones, and there's some information about William Patterson, the New Jersey Plan. One of the biggest one that's going to have to be discussed is how the southern states will get representation. Their populations were a little bit higher, but it was because they had slaves in their population. And while the southern states did not want to give the enslaved people rights to vote or rights for representation, they did want them to be counted in their population total so they could receive more representatives in Congress. Ultimately, the decision is made in order to kind of suffice and make the southern states happy while also pleasing the northern states, that we would come to the agreement on the 3/5 compromise. This is a lot of the times misinterpreted that each slave is represented or only seen as 3/5 of a person. But what it actually said in the 3/5 compromise is that for every 5 slaves in a state, 3 of them would be counted towards the population total. So by adopting this plan, it increases the southern states' representation by about a third. It gives them about a third more of the representation in our legislative branch than they would have gotten if they weren't counted at all. But it also protects the northern states by not giving the southern states too much representation for these enslaved people who the southern states, once again, did not really want to give any rights when it came to the government and voting and representation. So a lot of things had to be sorted out here. Another key kind of aspect to pay attention to when it comes to the Constitution, the 2 sides, was the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, which you will talk a lot more about in depth in your classes. But these 2 sides were basically some of the earliest political parties in a sense, and their main arguments were over how strong the federal government should be. Should we have a lot of power in the federal government, or should we not have a lot of power? The Federalists were on the side of Alexander Hamilton, who were much more inclined to having a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists obviously wanted the states to have more rights and a little bit weaker national government or federal government. I hope this was helpful. Just a quick overview of these notes. If you have any questions, reach out to your teachers, whether it be Coach Sharp, Miss Thompson, Miss Gould, or myself, and we will get to those questions. I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will catch you next time.